Welcome, Dr. McKenna. Um, I gather that you are here for this conference on progressive economics, and you have been a professor of economics for the past 4 decades, and you have given a series of seminars and classes or lectures, talks at this conference. Um, what I gather is that this world is facing twin problems, interrelated problems of psychological stress and economic strain. And somehow the present economic theories and philosophies and systems are not able to uh, free us from these two different problems. What is your views on how to proceed, or what can we do in this world to create a system in which people can live in peace and harmony and in prosperity and affluence?
Well, it's certainly clear that we live in a time where there are many problems, and the problems seem to be increasing each day. Many of them are rooted in the economy. Many of them are rooted in the fact that systems that we've had for quite a long time seem to be failing at this point. So if we look, for example, at the ability of the economy to provide sufficient number of jobs for people to not merely have a job, but to have a career, something that's meaningful for them. If we look at the ability to provide people with an income that's sufficient to lead a reasonably decent life, if we look at the ability of the economy to produce in a way that's sustainable and not cause irreparable damage to the environment, we see all of these problems seem to be getting worse rather than better. And surely a lot of the psychological tension that undoubtedly exists stems from the fact that no matter how hard people try, they can't seem to get a balance in their life. They can't seem to obtain a position in life that they feel is both worthwhile, is sufficient for them to maintain their families, to have their families flourish, to provide the kind of resources for their children's education. And so constantly there's the threat that what people may have today may be gone tomorrow. And so the question really becomes, is there a way to have an economy that provides people with nourishment that's truly meaningful, that it's clear that economic wealth all by itself doesn't really sustain people, and especially if economic wealth is very difficult to not merely obtain, but to, in fact, maintain, to have some security with respect to your earnings. And so the question becomes, is there an alternative way of looking at the purpose of the economy, and indeed looking at the purpose of life? Is there something more than just forever searching after material well-being, when even the material well-being doesn't seem to ever actually arrive and is almost always under threat? Is there a way to find a way that you can simultaneously feel some sustenance in your life, some meaning in your life?
Have you discovered the way? Have you discovered that such a way, or?
Well, I want to be honest and say that you discover inklings, you see possibilities, and those possibilities enable you to, for lack of a better word, to experiment, to go down new roads, to see where they will lead. The particular road that I've followed in this lifetime, and one of the reasons why I came to this this conference is the possibility that there is some meaningful sort of a meaningful spiritual dimension to the world, and that there are practical ways to go about experiencing it to determine for yourself whether it's real or whether it's a myth. And the idea is to see if that sort of widening vision of seeing the world as constituting something more than just the material doesn't simultaneously provide an inner dimension of peace and growth, and at the same time can alleviate some of the more material problems that we see. So the issue is, can there be a new way of looking at the world that in fact accomplishes what people seek?
Conference is being sponsored by the Prout movement, which stands for, as I understand, progressive utilization theory, a new socioeconomic theory propounded by one Indian philosopher, C.I. Prabhakar Sarkar. And you, as a professor of economics, how do you view his views on Proutist economics?
Well, what I would say is that at both the individual level and at the society level and at my own personal level, one of the feelings that constantly reoccurs is the feeling of imbalance, that no matter what you do, there's always something else taking you in another direction, seeming to make it difficult to not just make progress, but just to maintain oneself. And I think this is true at the level of society as well. If we look at what's taking place, we see not merely one problem after another, but problems that seem to be becoming deeper and more significant all the time. And so what Prout theory holds out as a hope is that there's a way of maintaining balance, both for the individual and for the society within which an individual lives. And in fact, what the theory believes or puts forth is the idea that there's a link between the two, that individuals will feel this sense of imbalance when the society is imbalanced, and society will be imbalanced when individuals feel this sense of imbalance. So the question then is, what's the proper role of the individual and in society once one recognizes that there is a link between the two? So the Prout theory takes this as a basic foundational issue and then attempts to provide the tools that can in fact bring about this balance. And indeed, the driving idea is one of a dynamic balance over time, that progress is being made, but it's being made in such a way that people feel that their lives and the society in which they live can responsibly deal with the questions that will arise. So it's not like there's some magic that's going to take place and everything will become perfect. Rather, it's the sense that one will acquire the abilities to deal with those problems in a progressive way. So,
can you give some concrete examples of what would be done differently if we approach the economy from that perspective?
well, for example, if balance is to be maintained both at the individual level and in society's level, then all parts of both the person and of society have to be treated with respect, have to be maintained. You can't have a process where only one part of the person is developed and everything is left behind. It would be like saying if someone spends all their time thinking, doing intellectual activity, but eats foods that are likely to produce a lack of health, then over time, even your ability to think clearly, to do the kind of thing that you might love, becomes endangered. And the same thing is true in society. If only one portion of society seems to be benefiting, and the rest of society is is lagging behind, the portion that seems to be benefiting is going to find at some time that their welfare will be endangered as well. That if everyone's not brought along at the same time, if that lack of balance, if that balance is lost, then eventually the entire society finds itself in imbalance. So to take a concrete example, when the financial crisis hit in 2008, everyone knew that there was a tremendous imbalance in the economies, particularly in the amount of debt that had arisen, both at the individual level and at the societal level. So the question was how to deal with this issue. Well, in the United States, which is where I live, a choice was made, and the choice was, well, we will help a portion of the economy deal with their debt problem. And that portion, of course, were the banks and the financial institutions. And so great efforts were made to ensure that the banking system and the financial system in general could return to health. But the same efforts were not made for the rest of society. So for people who had lost their homes, for example, or people who had mortgages that they could no longer afford and were in danger of losing their homes, there were no efforts made to help the imbalance that they were now feeling. And so what's been the result of that? While the banking system in the U.S. has returned to something that appears like normality, what we see is that 6 years after the crisis began, we still have relatively high rates of unemployment, and even though the rate seems to be coming down, it's coming down mostly because a significant proportion of those people who've lost their jobs have given up hopes of ever finding a job, and so they have left the labor market entirely, and once you leave, you don't count. So the number looks lower than it really is if we were counting those people. Also, because the home mortgage issue wasn't dealt with, we have an entire sector in the U.S. economy, the construction sector, which basically hasn't rebounded. The construction sector is an area that's always provided many jobs, and good jobs. It's been a place where people who might not have as much training or education could find jobs that were both meaningful and providing an income that families could have a decent living. So it appears that the financial sector is doing okay, but as long as the rest of the economy is lagging behind, there's going to come a point again where the financial system will also be strained, okay? And even the people who are benefiting now will tell you, for example, that the current system in some way encourages people to take on extra risk because they can't make enough from the alternatives that are less risky, so they go for more risky returns, and that just increases the chance of experiencing what we experienced in 2008 again. So what we see then is that the lack of a balance of the various parts of the economy over time will engender the kind of disequilibrium dynamics that we saw in 2008, and we need to find a way to ensure that that's not the constant path that we are on, that we have a way to bring everyone along so that progress can be made, that each individual can endeavor after those things they find important, that if they want to become a developer of new ideas to bring about economic growth, they can do that. If they want to write novels, they can do that. If they want to build houses, they can do that. That society is constructed so that there's room for people to do all the things that will enable them to grow. But the key is it enables everyone to grow, and that's what enables it to be sustained over time.
These austerity measures which the governments usually take when there is a recession, is that the right strategy, or has that ever worked? Or
I think You know, in economics, there are very few times when you can conclusively say that something is right or wrong, but I think this is one of those cases where it's pretty conclusively the case that austerity measures don't work and haven't worked. They've been tried more so in European countries, although to a certain extent in the U.S. And here we are six years later, and the austerity measures that were designed to bring down the debt levels in countries have not only not decreased debt levels, but in many countries, debt levels have actually increased. And this is also a case where most economists, not all, it's never unanimity among economists, but most economists knew that this would be the case. That economists were saying, when you're in a recession, when you have high unemployment, that is not the time for governments to engage in significant reductions in their level of expenditure. When you're at a time when interest rates are close to zero and your infrastructure in your economy is severely lacking, when bridges are in a state of disrepair, when schools are in a state of disrepair, when the healthcare system needs so much improvement, when the environment needs so much improvement, when we need to find ways to utilize new sources of energy that will be sustainable, now is the time when you do it, because when interest rates are close to zero, it essentially becomes free to do it. And when you have resources available, which is what's true when you have unemployment, why not utilize those resources in a productive way? So there's both the need to do it and the ability to do it. Instead, what's happened is that governments in many countries have chosen not only to not make use of the availability of resources because of unemployment, but have gone in exactly the opposite direction, have said we must cut back in these times, which is what austerity is all about. And we see the results. In Europe, it has not brought more growth. Indeed, in countries like Italy and Spain, and especially so in Greece, the economies are suffering greatly. In a country like Italy, we see that young people are leaving the country in huge numbers. A country like Italy, where it's so family oriented and their parents want their children close, even the parents are encouraging them to go to other countries because there are no jobs that are available. And the truth is, it didn't have to be this way. If governments had adopted the kinds of policies that basic economics recommends in these times, and basic economics recommends that when an economy is in a deep recession, that this is the time that governments can take action to not only bring the economy out of the recession, but to build the infrastructure that will enable the economy to thrive far into the future. We're very much in danger of losing this opportunity, and as a result, the possibilities, if you look at Europe as a whole, for example, the fear now is that it will enter some type of deflationary spiral where rather than there being growth, there'll be stagnancy for maybe decades to come. And so the likelihood of people finding the kinds of lives and being able to lead the kinds of lives they'd like to have is severely diminished by austerity type programs.
So how does Prout deal with this issue of inequalities, which Thomas Piketty has recently pointed out that it is been persisting, both inequalities in income as well as in wealth. Does Prout say anything about that, or how would you go about removing that?
Well, the magnificence of Piketty's book is that he has a wonderful way of describing the mechanisms of capitalism that lead to inequality, but then has amassed a truly magnificent body of empirical data to show what the trends have been in a capitalist system. And what his analysis reveals is that inequality seems to be the natural state of capitalism. That the only time we don't have great levels of inequality and increasing levels of inequality is during those times depressions and wars when capital, and Piketty defines capital in a very broad sense, but essentially when capital is destroyed, and so the owners of capital don't make the kinds of return that they do in normal times. In normal capitalist times, the returns to capital and capital's ability to save significant portions of those returns is what leads to a greater concentration of wealth in the hands of fewer and fewer people. And the data, it's just about irrefutable. I mean, it's what, as I say, what's so magnificent about his work is the extensive data that he has collected to buttress the story that he tells. Now, Prout understands that those kinds of levels of inequality are exactly the kinds of things that bring about imbalance. And so the Proutist goal is to find ways to first prevent that inequality from occurring in the first place, but then if there are imbalances to develop, to have means to fix them that benefit everyone rather than just the few. So how do you prevent inequality from occurring in the first place? Okay. Well, one of the things that's clearly true, and one of the things that Piketty himself mentions, is the importance of the development of human skills, of human potential. Okay? That's one type of capital that brings about a return. And it's a type of capital that attaches to people, so that if people can develop their skills, their talents through meaningful education, then that's one way, and certainly not the only way, but it's one way that more people can benefit from society to help eliminate problems of inequality. But it's also true that there needs to be mechanisms at the societal level that will deal with this. People such as Piketty recommend things like a tax on capital, where the tax can be used to fund the kinds of public goods that enable the development of skills for individuals, that enable the development of better healthcare systems, of better environmental systems. In this respect, Piketty is much like John Rawls. Rawls is the preeminent political philosopher of the 20th century. And every political philosopher, whether they agree with Rawls or disagree with Rawls, feel compelled to respond to his theory. That's the power of it. And what Rawls tells us is that a society, to be fair, is one that has to ensure that every person has the ability to lead a life that enables their development. The way he puts it is that even the worst off person in society has to be in a position where their welfare is maximized. And that welfare is not just material. Rawls goes out of his way to reveal that people are more than just a bundle of physical desires, that they have social desires, they have psychological desires, and those desires revolve around the relationships that they have with other people. So for someone like John Rawls, the idea that we are isolated individuals who derive no benefit from our interaction with others is an appalling notion. Rather, he understands that we become who we are, and we flourish through our relationships with others, and that those relationships must enable all to flourish. If one part gets most of the income and the wealth, they use that to undermine the other parts of society. So, for example, when wealth becomes concentrated, economic wealth, it can then be used to undermine the democratic nature of the political realm. Okay, something we see happening in the U.S., where increasingly elections hinge on how much money one has to spend. Increasingly, the wealthy people can guide entire campaigns because they have money all by themselves to fund individuals. But of course, those individuals then feel a commitment to what the wealthy desire, and the political system itself begins to be shaped in a way that focuses only on a small segment of society rather than the needs of the entire society. So I see people like Rawls and Piketty as basically telling us the same thing, which is that an economy left to itself, okay, the idea of just let the market do it, which is so prevalent in the world we live in, such an economy, in fact, undermines the ability of people to flourish in the long run, and that we have to take steps to prevent that from taking place. And what Prout provides are steps that can help to accomplish those goals.
If, for instance, you use inheritance taxes as one of the ways to reduce the inequalities, would it be, is that what Prout is recommending, or that would be unpopular kind of a solution?
Well, I think it's certainly consistent with Prout's philosophy. It's also a recommendation that Rawls made. Rawls basically took the view of saying, look, if people believe in private property, and if they think it's important that private property be the most prevalent form of ownership in society, then if it's such a good thing, everybody should own private property. It shouldn't just be the 1% who own the property and the 99% who do not. So what Rawls said is, if property is important, everybody should have ownership of property. What he also said is if we want to maintain the social balance, if we want to ensure that political rights and liberties are not undermined, that we need to ensure that wealth doesn't become concentrated in the hands of a small number of people who can then use that wealth to shape the political system towards their own ends rather than towards the ends of everyone. So what Rawls says is okay, let's push the idea that private property is important. But since it's important, let's ensure that everyone has private property, and one way we can do that is through the utilization of the inheritance tax. And basically what he said is look, when people amass wealth during their lifetime, okay, fine, they can use it during their lifetime. But once they die, why should their interests be governing those of us who are still alive and attempting to lead decent lives? Okay? And then, of course, the response is, well, people who have amassed this wealth should be able to determine who they leave it to. Okay? And Rawls basically said, okay, we'll let you do that, but the people you're leaving it to don't have any right that they can give, no justification for why they're entitled to it, so we'll place the inheritance tax on them. And the inheritance tax will then be a way of preventing the accumulation of wealth, so that helps to prevent the democratic rights from being undermined. But at the same time, the revenue can be used to purchase shares in the businesses that exist that will then become the property of all individuals. Okay, so that everybody will become a property owner. And while it may not be completely equal, Rawls was never someone who believed that you had to strive for equal ownership, it won't be so unequal that one portion of the society can undermine the rest. Now that idea is very consistent with Prout, because what Prout puts forth is the idea that incentives are necessary because different people have different desires. There are some people who are going to want to accumulate wealth. Fine, go ahead and do it. But we don't want that impulse to be so the sole driving force in society, because what it then does is to lead to the accumulation of wealth that undermines everything else. And what Prout strives for is a balance, a balance between the individual incentives, the individual drives, and doing that in a way that can be balanced in society as a whole. At the same time, there's another aspect of Prout which is important here as well, because Prout, because it has this view of people as being broader than might be true in a materialist view. Prout believes that there's a psychological aspect to people, but there's also a spiritual aspect to people. Prout believes that you can bring about a balanced economy by providing with the people with the tools that enable them to become balanced individuals. And here what I'm speaking about are practices that essentially enable a person to um, to be able to utilize their mind and the drives in their mind in a productive way. So Prout is based on a philosophical and a spiritual view that says people have within themselves much greater resources than even they imagine. And there are practical ways that they can be brought out. So it's not something that says, oh, if wait until you die and some great result will unfold before your eyes. No, it's saying right now, if you take these steps, if you practice these steps, if you do the kinds of spiritual practices, things like meditation, that you'll be able to gain a greater sense of balance in your being. Okay? It may not be perfect, it may take a while, but you'll see that the possibility exists of that, and that balance can then, in some sense, provide a natural check on the impulses. Because if a person is balanced, then they're not going to have the kinds of drives and needs that lead to excess.
So reducing the hours of work so that people have more time to spend on their intellectual development or spiritual development would be consistent with Proutist.
Certainly, okay, for those people who find that an appealing route to take, there certainly would be the possibility of doing that. And hopefully, because people would have the resources that would give them some security in their life, they would feel freer to maybe undertake some activities that in the world today they can't undertake because they constantly have to worry about their next paycheck and providing sufficient resources for their children and their family.
In the industrial development we have had in the past 2 centuries, we have gone far away from protecting the nature. We were just exploiting the nature but if we learn to live in harmony with nature, and in nature there is abundance, so that also opens the door for abundance in our life.
Mm-hmm.
So does Prout also recommend of how to take care of nature and how it could be harmonized or utilized so that it increases prosperity in the world, and
Mm-hmm.
rather than just leading to resource depletion, as the present economic growth models are leading towards.
Yeah, in the modern world we live in, almost everyone understands that there are serious problems, environmental problems, and that if we continue to proceed down the road that we're presently on, the likelihood of severe consequences is very high. In the present economic model, though, doing something about those problems requires that steps outside the market be taken. It's kind of an interesting thing. People in the world we live in now, especially in capitalist economies, are forever saying that we should have a free market. Just let the market take care of things. But economists who study these issues know that the market is not built to take care of the kind of environmental issues that we see. They use a term called externalities, which essentially means that there are costs and benefits that are generated which individuals are not required by the market to recognize. Okay, so when carbon dioxide is put forth into the atmosphere, it's clearly creating great costs for society, but the firms or the automobiles that are generating this carbon dioxide don't recognize that cost. There's no mechanism that requires them to recognize it, and as a result, it's as if they don't have to pay any attention to it, and we go on increasing the levels of carbon dioxide. So what Prout says is that, again, this is an indication of imbalance in society. What Prout recognizes is that interconnectedness is interconnectedness at very, very deep levels. It's not that human beings are here and nature is here. Human beings are part of nature. Okay? So we can't escape that fact. When we use the term interconnected, here it's really interconnected. We are part of nature, and nature, of course, is part of us. If we don't take care of that part, then the other parts of nature will, in fact, be damaged as well. So we know, for example, that if the temperatures on the planet continue to rise, that we will see increasing numbers of species simply vanish. They'll be gone forever. We know that if temperatures continue to rise at the rate that they are, that the way of life of people will be changed dramatically. There are areas in the world that will no longer exist. Okay, so depending upon the temperature rise, water levels will rise, and that will cause areas. So, for example, I've heard climate scientists say that Florida and Miami basically will no longer exist. Okay? So Prout recognizes that because of this interconnectedness, that one has to take steps to maintain balance so that you don't get to the point where the kinds of costs that we're talking about ensue. So for Prout, nature wouldn't be viewed as some external force, external to ourselves. It would be
In history, it has always been the leaders like Gandhi, like Nelson Mandela, like Mother Teresa, and many more. I think always somehow society has given rise to individuals who choose to think beyond themselves,
yes.
and who dedicate their life for this. So I think, but through education, probably this spirit of service and sacrifice can be built in. So I think that's why the Prout, I believe, is also engaging in new humanist education activities, starting schools for children, so that from an early age they can be given this spirit of service and sacrifice.
And given the tools within themselves to be able to become the same kind of people that Gandhi and Mandela and people like that became. And so that's the hope that Prout holds out. And of course, it's up to all of us to investigate that path to see if the hope can in fact be realized.